If you research the old world, you're probably familiar with the Great Fires, or the fire narrative. So I thought I'd make this video and present some of my perspective on the situation here. So we're going to be covering a good handful of fires and some of the visual evidence that were given, and then we're going to try to use our pattern recognition skills to correlate that with the descriptions we see and pick out the anomalies. So the first one we're going to be looking at here is during the War of 1812, when the White House was destroyed by fire. It was apparently the British troops. It was 1814, I believe, 2 years into the war, we are told. You look at the depictions, such as this one, and you can see basically a whole city on fire. But then when you look at the explanation that were given for it, we start to see subtle discrepancies. Now, this is snipped from Wikipedia, and they're explaining the situation to us here. It's interesting that they mentioned 4 days after the attack begins, a heavy thunderstorm, possibly a hurricane and a tornado, extinguished the fires, yet caused further destruction. And we're going to see other sources of further destruction as we move forward as well. Then I find this blurb that mentions that at the time, apparently, the U.S. Capitol was the only building in Washington worthy to be noticed. So right away, even 200 years ago, the story that we're getting down through time is inconsistent with what we're seeing. And I know they're drawings, but they're still attempting to depict something. For instance, is this supposed to be just the White House? Or do we see other buildings on fire here? And just for context, at the time, apparently the entire city of Moscow goes up in flames 2 years previous. And this having to do with the Napoleonic Wars at the time. So you have the War of 1812 happening on the North American continent, and then you have the Napoleonic Wars happening over in Europe. At which point do you begin to ask yourself that maybe something coordinated is going on here, and that what's being handed down to us through time is a fiction, is a story? And what's interesting about the Moscow fire is that apparently it is started by Russians themselves as an attempt to weaken the French army that had occupied Moscow. So let's see what else we have. The Great Fires. So let's begin with the Baltimore fire of 1904. Right away we are looking at, massive devastation for one. Also massive structures for such an early time period. Multi-storied structures. And certainly not looking old by any means as well. And you're going to see these shadowy figures in the streets of the devastation. Again, par for the course if you've done any of this kind of research. So it begins as a small fire in the business district, and the wind whips it into an uncontrollable conflagration engulfing large portions of the city. It's believed to have been started by a discarded cigarette in the basement of the Hearst building. And there's your Hearst building. And when all is said and done, we're told 1,500 buildings were completely leveled. Estimated losses up to $100 million. Miraculously, no lives were lost, we are told. Although some reports claim one man perished. They specifically mentioned that the domed city hall was preserved. So this gets into part of what I believe we're seeing with a lot of this narrative. So I think there was a lot of destruction going on. The inheritors were taking their place in these locations and destroying parts of the the cities that they wouldn't be able to fit their narratives. So I think that's a part of it. You're seeing a lot of, and I don't know if this is even real. This photograph here, or many of these photographs, there's a fakeness about them. For instance, you can see the horse and the wagon. They don't really seem to be on the street here. So you have to wonder, if you see fakery in one section of a photograph, you have to wonder what else has been falsified for our consumption. So I think there was a destruction going on, but I also think that the fire narratives are being used as a false start for the progress of the new world that the inheritors were bringing in. And we're going to see the narrative repeat itself many times here. We can see as the fire rages on out of control, they bring in the cavalry from other locations. In this case, units from Washington, D.C. And then they resort to desperate measures to halt the fire. Officials decided to use a fire break and dynamited the buildings around the existing fire. Now, is this cover for the actual intentional destruction of these buildings? Is this cover for the visuals that we're seeing? I think these are all worth consideration, and probably the answer is a little bit of both. But this is a great depiction of the destruction of the old world as far as I'm concerned. You can see it on full display here in the background with the post office and the city hall and the rubble in the foreground. We move on to Bangor, Maine, 1911, and if we investigate this photograph a little bit closer, we are seeing again evidence of the stone churches having been destroyed, and you're seeing the New World construction taking shape in this platform stick frame style in the foreground here. Old World here on the left, and you can see a New World structure going up right here. Bangor, Maine. The worst disaster to strike the city reshapes the city's landscape, destroys 267 buildings. So they always give the dollar value. I don't know how they can get it down to the penny. And this is quite comical, actually, taken right off the website. The fire starts apparently in a hay barn, and we are told that the fire spreads quickly from building to building, most of which were made of wood. Now I'm going to say that again as I zoom in on the picture that comes with this article. Most were made of wood. What are you seeing in these photographs? You're seeing brick structures that look like they've been ripped on the diagonal. And you're going to see this repeat itself as well. They're trying to cement the narrative that the old buildings that burned were predominantly made of wood. And then they'll also tell us that as a result, building codes were beefed up and people were forced to build with brick and stone. And they go on to explain here that many of the public buildings are destroyed in this fire. The savings banks and the libraries, City Hall. And they also say here, in the building's public library, 70,000 volume collection including historical documents tore through the school, Bangor High School, and even destroyed the central fire station. So we're looking at the destruction of any sort of written documentation in the past. And then when you put it together with how many locations had this going on, it starts to begin like a coordinated effort to erase the past, to destroy buildings that are inconvenient to the narrative, and to provide a false restarting of the historical narrative, a restarting of the building technologies that we're told existed. And perhaps that's why we're seeing a lot of these structures with the dates put on the front within this time period following many of these great fires. And the final clip from Bangor. There are no visible reminders of the largest calamity in the city's history, we are told. And I think that's par for the course as well. This has been all but erased, and it has to make you wonder what actually went on. Moving on to Boston, 1872. quite the devastation depicted in this as well. We do have some high quality photographs from that time period, somewhat high quality I suppose you could say. And again, we're looking at depictions of really looking like post-war landscape here, a cityscape. Something you would see after a city has been leveled with bombing. And people that get into the dirigible air travel end of the old world spectrum have suggested that there was potential for them to have weapons that could destroy from the sky, and that possibly what we're looking at is the destruction and aftermath of such an attack. 1872 is an interesting year. We're 1 year after the Chicago fire. We're also right around the time the United States is basically financially being taken over through the British assets, basically, and the U.S. is becoming incorporated. So it's certainly a pivot point in American history. And again, we're ticking all those boxes we expect to tick. Now this is interesting as well. We have the fire destroying 776 buildings. They tell us how quickly Boston built after the Civil War, and as a result, the water mains had not been upgraded, and providing that as a reason for the fire spreading so quickly. We're also told the fire itself created its own firestorm. It starts to sound quite fictional after a while. They do tell us the most of the buildings were made of brick and stone, but the window frames and other fixtures were made of wood, so apparently that's going to be enough for the fire to leap from building to building. And I think they're doing this because we have such good visual evidence of Boston after the fire. And one last blurb here. During the course of the fire, which burned uncontrolled for more than 12 hours, buildings were blown up using black gunpowder in a controversial effort to create a firebreak. Well, isn't that fantastic? It looks like they've been blown up, doesn't it? It also looks like these are very, very well-built structures for 1872. Multi-storied brick structures, 1872. Apologize for the graininess on this one. And we're getting the story that 2 Boston firemen were killed during the fire. And this certainly looks like something that would take many, many, many more lives than what they're telling us. Also indications of quite an industrial metropolis. Massive, massive structures for that early time period. Not fitting the historical narrative we're given. And we have Chicago, that should say 1871, I believe. And we get a little bit of narrative here. They talk about the exponential population growth in the decades leading up to the Chicago fire. They like to insert in here that many of the congested areas were wood-built structures, adding fuel to the fire, if you will. They also say that a major fire the previous night had exhausted firefighters and damaged their equipment, leaving them incapable to properly fight the fire, which I think is quite interesting as well. And no doubt a part of American folklore, now the only real fire that gets taught in the school system in the States. Mrs. O'Leary's cow knocks over the candle and ignites the blaze. Steady wind from the southwest carries the flames and blazing debris from block to block. The slums became kindling for the downtown conflagration, where even the supposedly fireproof stone and brick buildings exploded in flames as the destruction swept northward. In the end, the fire claims about 300 lives, destroys over 17,000 buildings. Roughly 1/3 of the city lay in ruin, and nearly 100,000 people are homeless as a result. Now that is absolutely catastrophic devastation. All beginning with a cow kicking over a candle. Another story that repeats itself is the miraculous rebuild of these locations. The city rebuilds quickly, and by 1880 its population has reached just 500,000 people. You have a long list of architects that beautify the city in its recovery process. And remember too, Chicago hosts the World's Fair in 1893. So try to envision the massive amount of construction that would have been going on back then. You think they would have been able to get one of those panoramic views just like they do for the fires. So those architects stick around in the post-fire rebuilding era and design a new generation of even taller downtown buildings here. They're telling us, okay, all of this comes about after the fire. They couldn't possibly be before 1870 because those all were built as a result of the fire. So you see here how the narrative is being set and the timeline is being laid out for us. We get a little bit of fake news from the past here with the Chicago Tribune reporting that by 1870 most of Chicago was made of wood. Lumber being cheaper than brick and was more easily procured and more rapidly handled. So street after street were lined with wooden buildings. This is a fatal flaw in their narrative as far as I'm concerned. As you're looking at these visual representations of brick and stone buildings having been obliterated. And interestingly, at the same time as the Great Fire of Chicago, other fires in the general area of North America are breaking out. We have this one on Lake Michigan's east coast in the forests. We have the Peshtigo fire. So a very curious time for this region. And what do you think when you get a sense of the overall narrative? Is there deception at play here? Is it just sloppiness down through time? I think there's much more going on here, but we'll move on. We move on to Dayton, Ohio, 1913. We have a flood in combination with fires, as you can see depicted here. And you get, again, the miraculous rebuilding effort that goes on after the devastation of the flood and fires in Dayton, Ohio. And again, you're seeing the visual representations of a much more catastrophic devastation than you would expect to see. Also, interesting depiction here of the flood and classic old world structures with crappy signs on the side. Houston, the Great Fifth Ward Fire of 1912, Houston, Texas. Again, showing very similar visuals. The Great Fifth Ward Fire. The strong winds spread the fire's embers, set wood shingle roofs on fire. It consumes a church, school, 13 industrial plants, 8 stores, and 119 homes. No deaths, though. Again, strange the low fatality numbers coming out of these fires, and my lunch break has noted that in his work over on that channel. Jacksonville, Florida, 1901. Again, looking like Hiroshima or Nagasaki after the bombing in World War II, which really in itself is its own story. This one begins from a spark at a kitchen fire, lighting some Spanish moss drying nearby. In the end, we have over 2,000 buildings destroyed, 10,000 people are homeless, 7 dead. And of course, over the next decade, the city rebuilds its downtown miraculously. Everybody bands together and builds multi-storied brick structures, of course. And this would be the Armory, Jacksonville Armory, after the fire. It almost looks like munitions blew up inside it and took out most of the building, leaving the shell of a castle, something that you would maybe expect to see in the European countryside. But no, this is Jacksonville, Florida. And here we have the heroic band of firefighters showing off their physical prowess by climbing the flagpoles. Not even sure how this guy is staying on this pole. Curious photograph. Absolute devastation. And you have to wonder really about this whole reset narrative that we here in the Old World community have been suggesting through our research. I think enough evidence is being uncovered to suggest that something along those lines occurred, even just with the scant evidence we have been handed down through history. We can turn the clocks back to 1835, the city of New York catches fire. Again, you can see the style of buildings being depicted here. On the night of December 16th, 1835, it was so frigid and cold, yet onlookers crowded the banks to watch New York burn down. The city's entire financial district went from the thriving center of American business to a pile of ash and rubble. Even the river caught fire at one point. 17 blocks are leveled by the end of it. $500 million worth of property. And it says here too, New Yorkers can thank this blaze for the water they drink and the streets they traverse even today. So these types of things are given credit for the overhaul of the infrastructure, such as the plumbing and street size and all the rest of it. All of these things coming about as a result of the devastation, these cities being given a chance to rebuild and update their infrastructure. So again, a part of the false start narrative, I would suggest. So in a last-ditch effort to save the lower Manhattan, firefighters attempted to destroy the fire's fuel by blowing up some of the wooden buildings at the massive fire's perimeter, but it failed. They talk more about Marines managed to incinerate some of the combustible buildings at the perimeter. Amazingly, only 2 people die in the blaze, but it changes New York. The city planners decide to try to impose some order on the city's topsy-turvy lower section. They widened the streets and created the grid that's still there today. Now, 1835 is very, very early on, before the horse-drawn streetcars come into the picture. But we're being told here that these streets are widened at this point in time to justify and to allow for all of these supposed future technologies to be a part of the infrastructure. So again, I think we're looking at a false start narrative, and we're also being given a reason for the city to build the aqueduct at that time. And looking north of the border, the capital of Canada, Ottawa, has its own great fire in 1870, not far away from the Chicago fire, as the raven flies. And again, look at the quality of the architecture itself. Some of these are depictions of the Canadian Capitol building catching fire from a different era. When we move on to Portland, Maine, the Great Fire of 1866, predating the Chicago fire, but showing us all of the same results that we're used to seeing. Very strange. You get the strange gents standing on top of the wall for a photograph, looking ever suspicious. St. John, New Brunswick, Canada, 1877, time frame again. We're over the target as far as the time frame goes. There seems to be a bit of coordination. You can even wonder if these dates are falsified, and if we're looking at destruction from a much closer period of time, and it's been stretched out for us so as to not arouse our suspicions. Because what do we have to go by really is just the accounts of the newspapers at the time and historians after the fact. Looking like a before and after. And I'll just read you some of the narrative. This fire starts when a spark falls into a bundle of hay in Henry Fairweather's storehouse. in the York Point Slip area, present-day Market Square. Wooden structures predominant in St. John at this time were tinder, dry, and highly flammable. Come on. Same old, same old, same old. At times the fire reached temperatures perhaps so high some buildings exploded into flames without actual contact with the fire. Can you believe it? And when all is said and done, over 1,600 structures burned down, including 8 churches, 6 banks. Can you imagine such devastation in a single event? 14 hotels. 14 hotels? And they have even some boats in the harbor. Nearly all of the public buildings, principal retail establishments, lawyers' office, and all but 2 printing firms were burnt in the inferno. Okay. 19 people die as a result. Interestingly, it says here, several thousand people moved to nearby Portland. Well, we just saw Portland had its own fire in 1866. So the area in question receiving the brunt of the blow here. We have the account of the relief efforts here, and of course, the Independent Order of Oddfellows make an appearance, and other fraternal societies organizing relief efforts to aid the fire victims. And with a strong sense of civic pride, the people turn immediately to restoring their city, unfazed by the devastation, of course, or the lack of insurance, apparently, on many of these structures. And this gives us a nice false start for the existing government buildings, such as the new post office and the custom house, and so on. Within a year of the fire, 1,300 buildings were constructed, and hundreds more rebuilt in the next decade as funds became available. And we have more evidence of your mostly wood fire, and you can't tell me there's no fakery going on here. Look at the size of these blocks. We have a quick depiction of her early San Francisco fire. This gets covered in John Levi's book. I've covered it in other videos as well. We have a series of 4 to 6 fires in a 2 to 3 year period of time. At a very, very, very early time period. Remember, 1849 is when the gold rush kicks off in San Francisco. So then you have San Francisco burning multiple times in that period. Clearly, to me, a false narrative. But we'll keep moving forward. We have the Seattle fire, also covered in my Seattle video, if you haven't seen that. 1889, you're seeing a lot on the West Coast going up in this time period. So we have a 15-20 year time gap from the ones on the East Coast. Vancouver going up, Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada going up, I believe, in 1886. Calgary the same year, I believe, 1886. Seattle. We'll move forward here with Seattle. But we're seeing the same evidence and the same style of building. Now, isn't Seattle supposed to be sawmills? And you certainly don't expect to see this type of architecture in Seattle. Looking like it could easily be on the East Coast, like we saw. Multi-storied brick structures, very old-looking brickwork here. Absolute devastation. June 6th. That would be 6/6. Seattle workshop sweeps through some 100 acres, destroying much of the city's business. Turning point for the city, of course it is. And this time the culprit is a pot of heated glue. And we also get the mention again of a wood frame building, allowing the fire to spread quickly through mills, warehouses, piers, and hundreds of businesses. Unusually dry, warm spring, limited water supply, poorly trained. Are we seeing the story repeat itself? It feels like it's written by the same hand. Maybe it really is an AI-generated narrative of our history, and maybe we are just getting to the bottom of it. Miraculously, no lives were lost. Would you look at that? The citizens banded together. Didn't I just show you that in St. John? At rapid speed. They gathered together to decide what to do. They created the first comprehensive building code, requiring structures within the fire zone to be constructed with brick or stone instead of wood. Thank God. Thank God they started using brick and stone. because they weren't already, right? And this is just rich. Seattle emerges more modern and resilient as a result of the fire, with 465 new buildings and a population increase of more than 30% within 1 year of the fire. I know I would definitely love to move to a city that just had its central downtown burned to the ground. Sure would make an attractive place to move to, wouldn't it? They think we're stupid. Look at these. Look at these wooden structures. Thank heavens they changed the building code to brick and stone. That'll prevent the next one. Come on. If I sound like I'm getting impatient, because when you put them all together like this, to me it becomes quite obvious. I'll just quickly show you Spokane, then I think I'm going to sign off. I have more for you. Maybe I'll package them together in another Great Fire compilation. But I think this is worth mention as well. Spokane, just down the way from Seattle in Washington State. Same year, you notice several months later, most of downtown Spokane was destroyed by fire as well. The conflagration broke out in an area of flimsy wooden structures, quickly spread to engulf the substantial stone and brick buildings of the business district. One person died. After the fire, Spokane experiences the Phoenix effect, typical of many cities destroyed by fire. It certainly is the Phoenix effect. I think what we're witnessing here with the narrative is quite clearly a false start, falsification of the events of what went on in the 1800s. Likely a cover story for the destruction and overhaul of many of these inherited cities here in North America. And down through time, all it becomes is an almost forgotten story of fire and devastation. But we are peeking into history, and we are pointing out the flaws, and we have found many here. Thank you for watching. This has been an old world exploration. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe, hit the thumbs up button, and comment. I believe we are in the process of remembering who we really are and casting off the shackles of illusion. Until next time.